Hello, I'm Rebecca the Maths Lady, here to help you become an expert primary maths teacher so that all your children love their maths and become fluent, creative and confident with it. This is the 12th video on teaching maths to 6-year-olds or 6 to 7-year-olds, and this video is all about geometry. So we'll be covering shape, that's 2-dimensional flat shape and 3-dimensional shape, and we'll also be covering position and direction. In this video, I'll be explaining ways in which we can introduce children to more 2-dimensional shapes than they've come across before. So we'll look at all the quadrilaterals and we'll introduce pentagons and hexagons. We'll talk about how we get children drawing shapes with a straight edge. We'll look more deeply at 3-dimensional shapes and we'll start to consider faces, edges and vertices. We'll talk about movement, position and direction and giving directions and making turns. And through all the work on 2-dimensional shape, 3-dimensional shape and giving directions, we'll be talking about right angles and learning to see them and recognise them. Right, let's get started talking about 2-dimensional shapes. At this stage, it's lovely to start to introduce your children to a wide variety of 2-dimensional shapes. These are the common quadrilaterals. Can you name them as a teacher for a start? We've got the parallelogram, which is the pushed over rectangle at this level. We've got this trapezium. Now that is a symmetrical trapezium, which is called an isosceles trapezium. They don't have to be symmetrical. The key thing about a trapezium is that it has to have one pair of parallel sides. So it could be a bit tipped over. Then we've got the square and the rectangle that they should already have come across. The rhombus, and we do call it a rhombus, although they might have called it a diamond. We have a kite. We've got an arrowhead, which doesn't have to be symmetrical. And then, of course, there are quadrilaterals that don't fit any of the definitions, and they're called irregular quadrilaterals. We are not expecting children to become fluent on all of that, but it is such fun to explore, and that's what we're going to do deeply this year. So one of the things that we want to do is to get children to try and draw these shapes for themselves, just to try. Maybe on whiteboards where they can rub them off immediately if they get them wrong. We want children to start to use a straight edge, but we're not concerned about them measuring yet. That's going to come next year. It's just the physical manipulation of holding a ruler and drawing a straight line on it that we're focusing on. Now, you can get rulers that have ridges, handles along them. And it's a really good idea to have at least some of those, because for some children it's what they need for this topic to be fun for them, because that handle is going to give them the control so they can really get into thinking about shape and not have to worry about the rulers. Some children will be fine with ordinary rulers without ridges. But if you can get a class set of the ones with handles, that's a great idea, because then they all feel the same. And there's no issue with some children needing them and needing to ask, which is nice. So once they've had a go at drawing some of the shapes and are beginning to become confident with drawing straight lines, then we can focus in on one of the shapes at a time. Let's look maybe at a parallelogram. Who can draw the best parallelogram? Who can draw the most interesting parallelogram? Who can draw the parallelogram that looks least like a parallelogram but still meets the rules? And you don't need to clearly define those rules. They can become apparent through the task, through the discussions that children have with each other and with you. And you can set similar tasks for the other shapes to explore them. Kites and rhombuses are really hard to draw. So a great way to do them is to fold a sheet of paper in half, like this, and just get the children to draw any two straight lines and then cut along them. And when you open them up, you should get a kite. Can they make a more interesting kite? Who can make the best kite? Can we fly our kites? Can we make a display with them? Maybe there's a bit of Mary Poppins in there, or at least a song. Just have some fun. If shape isn't fun, which bit of maths is going to be fun? And the next level of challenge is then with rhombuses. Now for rhombuses, we're doing the same thing, but the two lines need to be the same length as each other. That's what you need to control to get a rhombus. Any two straight lines will give you a kite when you cut them out. Got to be the same length to get a rhombus. I also want to recommend this pattern block activity set. There are lots of trapeziums and rhombuses of different shapes in this. You get this bag of shapes. You can see you've got some skinny rhombuses and some fat rhombuses, hexagons in there. And then there are all sorts of challenges, starting with very simple ones where all the shapes are shown and children just have to put the shapes on to make a pattern. And then there are ones where there are blocks of colours, so you know which shapes you're looking for and you've got to think a little bit. Then you've got ones where the colours are missing. And then there are some much harder challenges in there, which I would expect are beyond this year. But if you've got some kids who are just flying, there are some more challenging things in there. That is Learning Resources Pattern Block Activity Set. One other nice little trick that you can try with your children before we leave quadrilaterals is that you can start with any rectangle. Take this whole sheet of paper. If you draw a diagonal and cut along that diagonal and then just turn one side round and put the pieces back together along the diagonal, you always get a kite. And you might like to discuss what's happened. We've gone from a shape where the two short sides are opposite each other to a shape where they are next to each other and the two long sides are next to each other. That's the key observation of what's going on there. Right, pentagons and hexagons. Now you may have some manipulatives with pentagons and hexagons. My favourite by miles is magnetic polydron. And if you look carefully behind me here, you can see pentagons and hexagons in my wonderful football. Now, people who buy magnetic polydron normally buy triangles and squares, and they're great. But there is this pentagon and hexagon kit as well, which makes this. That's a bit of a challenge for year twos, although it's lovely to do with them. But the key thing you want to explore with them is tessellations, and you also want to do that with triangles and squares, so they fit them together and see how they cover space with no gaps. And of course your hexagons are also going to cover space with no gaps when you lay them out like this, but your pentagons aren't. Pentagons always leave gaps, they don't tessellate. And that's a key difference between pentagons and hexagons that really brings it home that they are very different shapes. The other thing with your hexagons is that you can substitute triangles for hexagons. 6 equilateral triangles from the kit will make one of these. So it's wonderful to make tessellating patterns with a mixture of hexagons and triangles. Now, I know this stuff is expensive, but as a teacher, you just have to be canny. If you've got parent fundraising groups, this is the kind of stuff they love to buy because it'll be around for years. All their kids will benefit from them. It's a one-off payment. And you also have to be canny and look out for when there are little bits of budget around that need spent by the end of the financial year. And you jump in and you go, I want my magnetic polydron, and you will not regret that. It is so much fun. I don't get paid by anyone for recommending resources. This is just the truth. So we have to teach children how to remember the names. Pentagon. Penta means 5, but you don't come across it very often in vocabulary. You can show them pentagrams. I'm always tempted to rename my hand as being a pentafinger. Just play around with the vocabulary of penta. Show me your pentafingers. 5 digits, 4 fingers and a thumb. Penta, 5. Pentafinger. And if they physically do that movement, they're going to link the penta bit to 5-ness of 5. Hex doesn't really mean 6. There aren't lots of words that start with hex. So it's useful to say, well, hex has 3 letters and ends in X, and so does 6. So a hexagon is a sixagon. If you stick at it, you'll get there. And of course, that's really useful vocabulary for them to be confident with. If you're getting your children confident with all this vocabulary at this stage, you're doing an amazing job. Now, at this stage, you can do competitions with children in pairs where one child faces away, you draw a picture on the board, the first child in the partner has to draw it on their whiteboard, and the second child has to name it. That kind of thing is really good for reinforcing all this vocabulary you've just worked on and building confidence. There's a couple more tasks you can do with all these shapes. One is to look for the right angles in them. Which of these shapes have right angles in? Which shapes could have right angles in? Well, the square and the rectangles must have right angles in, and you want to give children a bit of paper with a square corner so they can test right angles, or maybe a bit of card. Which shapes could never have right angles in? Which shapes might have right angles in, but often don't? And here you can take your journey beyond regular pentagons and hexagons, because pentagons and hexagons are just shapes with 5 and 6 sides. They do not have to be these shapes where all the angles are the same and all the sides are the same length. So you could get pentagons and hexagons with right angles in. And of course you can start to build patterns. Well, the tessellations are the most obvious ones, and sequences where shapes go 3 sides, 4 sides, 5 sides, 6 sides. But you can also do patterns with colour or whatever patterns you want. Let's have an art lesson with all these wonderful shapes and see what the children can do now they can draw straight edges. Right, let's have a look at our 3-dimensional shapes. You will need a standard box of shapes that you get from most educational suppliers, and you need to explore them. And the key vocabulary we're introducing at this stage is the vocabulary of faces, flat faces, flat faces, edges, and vertices. And the bit of vocabulary we need to exclude is sides, because sides are confusing. We don't know if sides are edges or if they're faces. That's the complexity of 3-dimensional shape. And we want to explore those shapes in the real world and get children to find cones and prisms and cuboids and cubes and spheres, of course, and then have the same conversation about their faces, edges and vertices. They may bring in some 3-dimensional shapes that don't quite fit these categories, which can be wonderful because the faces may have different 2-dimensional shapes for the faces, and you can discuss that. Obviously the children couldn't do this book yet, but it's lovely if you or a teaching assistant wants to have a go at making some slightly more complex shapes. These are the shapes that are in this book. This one's got a lovely rhombus as one of the faces, which is nice. And if children can just observe an adult enjoying doing this kind of thing and see that this is something in their future and they're going to be exploring nets and making 3-dimensional shapes in their future, that's quite an exciting thing and quite a powerful thing. That book is Make Shapes 1, and it's available from Tarquin or other educational suppliers. At some stage during the year, you should be doing something with dough in craft in some context, whether it's clay or plasticine or cookery. You've got some dough in your hands, just stop for a minute, challenge the children to make some of their common 3-dimensional shapes quickly, and then demolish them and get on with the task that you're doing. It's a powerful thing to do. They can really show you if they understand those shapes or not. And you can talk again about faces, edges and vertices in a new and exciting context. The other thing that's nice to talk about is the symmetry of both 3-dimensional and 2-dimensional shapes. With 3-dimensional shapes, it's a plane of symmetry. And by a plane of symmetry, I mean like a piece of paper cutting through a shape. And if you're making it with dough, that's so much easier to show. But of course, with 2-dimensional shapes, it's a line of symmetry, and you want to get your mirrors out and have a good look at what's going on. One more bit with your 3-dimensional shapes. Can children see any right angles in these 3-dimensional shapes? Sometimes they can see the right angles in the corners of the 2-dimensional shapes that form the faces. Sometimes they can see right angles between two faces. So right angle between that face and that face. All powerful discussions. And finally, position and direction. Children need to be challenged to move forward, backwards, sideways, left and right, different numbers of paces. They need to be challenged to turn clockwise and anti-clockwise through quarter turns, half turns and through right angles, and they need to link right angles to being quarter turns, and ideally a 3/4 turn to being 3 right angles. And of course you can get children moving, you can set up mazes, you can get them to give each other instructions, and you can get your roamers out, your B-bots, and program them. If you've got children who are struggling to understand position and direction and their left and right and so on, it's really worth doing some quick checks on their motor sensory integration. And here's a link to a video that explains those tasks and the resources for those activities. So your key takeaway from this video is that shape is loads of fun. There are loads of great activities we can use to introduce children to far more shapes than they've seen before, to pay attention to them, to start to understand how they differ from each other, but mainly to have fun with them. So we've introduced the quadrilaterals and pentagons and hexagons. In 3D shapes, we've looked at faces, edges and vertices. We've talked about position, direction and turn. Throughout all of it, we've thought about right angles in 2-dimensional shapes, 3-dimensional shapes and in physical movement. And it's a really good idea to think about symmetry. at every stage of this as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you find it useful. If you do, if you've got time to like, subscribe, leave us a comment or a question, share it with your colleagues or your friends, that would be absolutely great. Thank you for taking this time to invest in your professional development so that you can be a fabulous teacher and we can raise a generation of brilliant mathematicians. Take care. Bye for now.